Hello everyone, welcome back to the Hindu Explainer series. I am Kushagra Goel and very warm greetings from Law Prep Tutorial. At this juncture, I know a lot of you must be feeling a lot of anxiety, and trust me, it is natural. When you see a lot of negative news in the newspaper, which we are seeing for the past 2-3 days, it is completely normal to feel a little worried. In general, feel low. And if that is happening to you, don't worry, you're not alone. We here at Law Prep Tutorial completely understand this concern that students have been facing. And therefore, it is important that you all keep your momentum up, take care of yourselves, because at this juncture, that is the most necessary thing that you all should be indulging in. All right. At this point, so yesterday I'd asked related to the Swayam portal. Now, the question was about those education channels because yesterday we talked about an editorial that called for education from free to air channels. And these free to air channels are known as Swayam Prabha channels, right? What does Swayam mean? Swayam is a portal of the Government of India which stands for Study Webs of Active Learning for Young Aspiring Minds such as all of you. And in that regard, you get a lot of education content for even your grade, for those who are appearing economics related, policy related updates that are available on these channels for all students. And in that regard, we had another thing that I will be putting up as a question for all of you, which will be related to ASEAN. So we are going to follow up on related to another international event that is taking place, which is the ASEAN Summit. The details about the climate change summit, the leader summit that has taken place in the United States becomes really important. So I hope all of you had made the relevant notes that are important for that. Then moving on today's newspaper. So on the front page, it's all related to the COVID pandemic and the second wave that we are engulfed in, oxygen supply leading to deaths, hospital fire that are leading to deaths at different places, different parts of the country. In that regard, realizing that there is a need because of limited lockdowns that are happening in the country, the central government has once again started the scheme to allocate 5 kilograms of grains to the poor. The scheme under which this was started last year also will be benefiting 80 crores Indian, and the scheme name is Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana or PMJKAY. Also in that regard, there is now as India is participating in more and more genome sequencing, we are finding that different mutations and strains of the coronavirus are responsible for the second wave of the COVID-19. In that regard, the UK strain, which we know as B117, is responsible for a large number of cases in Delhi. And along with that, the Indian variant, which is the double mutant, which is B1617, is also responsible for a lot of other cases in the capital. Then moving on, apart from that, there is concern about lack of space for burning bodies because of high number of fatalities under the second wave of COVID-19. So that is the primary news. Different state governments are collaborating and have called the central government to provide one nation, one cost for vaccination. As we know, the Serum Institute, the Covishield vaccine manufacturer, has announced that it will be selling the vaccine to state governments at 400 rupees per dosage. There is also a report of how the pricing of Covishield, which is manufactured in India, is the highest it is across the world wherever the AstraZeneca or Covishield vaccine is being supplied or provided. Serum Institute is the one which has manufactured the AstraZeneca or the Covishield vaccine for countries such as UK, US, other countries such as South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. Everywhere else, the vaccine price is less than $3. But in India, if we price it at 600 up to 400 to 600, it is still higher than those countries, which is $6 to $8 international pricing, which shows that how, therefore, different state chief ministers have been calling the central government to rein in and ensure that Indians during the pandemic are not robbed of in need of vaccines. Then moving on the editorial front. So, as I've told you again and again, the purpose of the series is to ensure that you reduce the time spending and focus on what is more relevant. The editorials today are partly those which can totally be avoided. So the main one, India's COVID crisis when difficult became worse, tracks down how we let this happen. For example, it talks about the massive election campaign that it was running in West Bengal, and until a couple of days ago, Prime Minister, when he was taking a rally, he called upon his supporters to be as like a sea of supporters, which is something that the coronavirus definitely loves. Crowding is something that the coronavirus definitely loves. And in West Bengal now, the number of cases after each polling day have shot up in every district where polls have been held. In that regard, now later steps have taken. Then the editorial also talks about different control strategies. But in that regard, it is being called that India is testing less, because the ideal testing percentage, it should be 5% or below than that. That means that we need to ramp up our testing far more. And for every 100 tests, only 5 should turn up positive. If there are, as the rate is showing right now in the country, which is above 30% at a lot of places, a lot of cases are going undetected. In that regard, it is important for us to ramp up our testing. Plus, looking forward, we need the only way ahead out of the pandemic is universal vaccination. Faster pace of vaccines is what the editorial states. Then on the left hand side, infernal infernos. This is talking about while Maharashtra has borne the brunt of the coronavirus with reporting the highest number of cases for months, at the same time, fire at hospitals has also become a problem for the state. This calls, then the editorial calls for a fire audit of all the hospitals, plus ensuring a safety checklist that is necessary to ensure that this overall, the second concern, that along with health facilities, this is something that is not happening, and that is something that should be done at the same time, because while the health infrastructure is on its brim, it is important that those who are relying on the health infrastructure, it is sustainable and strong enough against fire safety hazards. Then moving on, too little, that election commission's steps now are too little in terms of so two things have happened related to this. One, election commission has now come up with new guidelines wherein only 500 people are allowed for participating in election rallies. Road shows have been banned. Plus, campaigning has to stop 72 hours prior. Now, when the timeline of the election had come out, a lot of political parties had criticized the election in West Bengal being too prolonged, and this was something that was seemed to have favored one political party, which the editorial talks about. Then secondly, it also states that how the ruling party, the central government's political party, is the one that was continuing to ensure larger rallies, which is something that should not be done. It criticized the Prime Minister for gloating massive turnout at his rallies. Overall, it states that secondly, the Election Commission took all these steps to curb or ensure limited participation of large-scale gatherings during the election campaign only after the High Court, the Calcutta High Court, called in the Election Commission to tell it what measures it was taking to ensure that the spread of COVID-19 is not led by the election campaign. But that is something that is being called in the editorial as too little, too late. Then the fourth editorial, the second one, arise and rejuvenate the third layer of governance under the 73rd Amendment Act of the Constitution. Panchayati Raj Systems is now the third tier of decentralization under our constitution, and this is by Kamal Hassan, actor plus one whose party is running in Tamil Nadu assembly elections, has stated that how the state government of Tamil Nadu has not called in elections of the panchayats till now. Something that should be done every 5 years has not been done till now by the state government there, which is leading to a violation of constitutional responsibility, plus limiting the scope of decentralization and governance in the constitution. So in such editorial, it becomes important for us to call upon and revise our overall constitutional related topics. Not every editorial is relevant, but information about it becomes related to other aspects of your CLAT examination, such as this editorial is about constitutional responsibilities, constitutional provisions. So thus it becomes important that you do so. So information in this editorial primarily 73rd Amendment for Panchayati Raj, third tier of decentralization. Then 5 years has to be the time period after which elections should be taking place. There is a State Election Commission. We recently discussed a State Election Commission judgment wherein the Supreme Court called that state election commissioners have to be independent individuals and not employees of the state government. Thus, this is a time when you should revise that judgment, go back to when we had discussed it. All right. Then moving on, the editorial also talks about how 24th April is celebrated as Panchayat Raj Day, and thus giving out examples of Mahatma Gandhi, who always called for village and panchayat to be the crux and the center of development in the country and for social mobility of the masses. Then moving on the ground zero, it's related to West Bengal elections, not relevant for us at all. Then moving on the other national news. Now, so yesterday we had discussed that this would be the last day of CJI Sharad Arvind Bobde, and now Justice N.V. Ramana will take oath as the Chief Justice. He will be taking his oath at the Rashtrapati Bhavan. The President is the one who administers oath to the Chief Justice of India. He will be taking over as the 48th Chief Justice of India. And then this article talks about the general, what the tenure of Justice Bobde has been about. His contribution specifically has been more pronounced in the terms of environment, where in different projects he has asked before felling of trees that a quantification value of each tree should be done, and in that regard compensation plus afforestation measures should be undertaken by any industry that is taking over or causing felling of trees. Then on the right hand side, there is news calls grow for US to help India with spare vaccines. Now US is now overflowing with vaccines. It already has more vaccines than it needs. Then secondly, there are two things that US is being called for. One, give up the DPA, that is the Defense Production Act, for vaccine input goods for vaccine. So in vaccine, it's not just the technology that is relevant. You need input goods that are imported from different countries. In that regard, US has been controlling the flow of these input goods because it needed vaccines for itself. But now that the need of vaccines in the United States is less, and India needs to ramp up its vaccine production, as we had discussed, Adhar Poonawalla, the CEO of Serum Institute, had called US to give up control in that regard. The second thing now is being called is that the United States Trade Representative should give up or the WTO should relinquish intellectual property rights related to vaccines so that different countries can manufacture them for a time period. That for 1 year, companies, anyone who can manufacture vaccines should be allowed to manufacture these vaccines of different countries without paying or being limited by intellectual property. Now, under IP, when you make a patent, only those who hold a license from the patent holder can manufacture the same good. Otherwise, it would be a violation of their intellectual property right. In that regard, this protection to international companies. So, US has Moderna, Pfizer vaccines, and the Johnson and Johnson vaccine. Now, if for example, I am a manufacturer in India and I want to produce those vaccines in India, either I need a license from these companies who have the patent, or if I produce it without their approval, then I would be violating intellectual property rights, and India can be held accountable under WTO to protect and ensure IPR of these companies. It is this limitation or waiver from WTO that is being sought while India needs more vaccines to tide over the second wave. Now, we need to wait as to what steps that are actually taken. Then, on this article talks about the new book that Shiv Shankar Menon, our former National Security Advisor, has written. His new book is India and Asian Geopolitics, the Past and Present. It is his new book. Then moving on, the Armed Forces Medical Services will be procuring 23 mobile oxygen production plants from Germany, as has been declared. They will be transported by aircraft, and helicopters will be used to airlift oxygen containers as essential drugs from one part of the country to another. Plus, Air Force will also be used. So we discussed roll-on, roll-off trains for oxygen tankers. Now, to return these, it will be Indian Air Force which will be airlifting these containers back to the place where they will be refilled, and the train will then run towards the areas where it has to. So those are steps that the country is taking to tide over the high demand for oxygen. There is further demand for oxygen trains at different locations, which is coming from Delhi, Uttar Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, and Maharashtra. And India is now yesterday it reported 2,624 fatalities related to COVID-19 in a day. In that regard, one positive news is that the Covishield vaccine can provide protection against the double mutant of coronavirus. This is based on preliminary examinations and tests conducted on vaccine efficacy. Then moving on the international news, one big news for us is the ASEAN Summit. The ASEAN Summit is in highlight, not just because it is an important summit, but also because it is in the backdrop of Myanmar military leader Min Aung Hlaing being invited to represent Myanmar. The people of Myanmar have been calling that this is an illegitimate government. The military takeover is illegitimate, and therefore ASEAN should not recognize the military or the junta as the legitimate government of Myanmar. In that regard, a little bit of history of ASEAN. Founded in 1967, the first summit of ASEAN took place in 1976 in Bali, Indonesia, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It is in that regard what is discussed at the ASEAN Summit becomes important for us to discuss tomorrow. All right. Then apart from that, China's National Security Office to open permanent base in Hong Kong. Hong Kong last 1 year has come completely transformed into now a proper territory of China. The system of one nation, two systems has now completely been removed. In that regard, following up on the other national news, Russia is pulling back troops from Ukraine border, so easing of tensions in that regard. Plus, Frantic search operations for the submarine of Indonesia have been going on, but to no avail. The oxygen of the submarine will run out, the KRI Nagala 402 by Saturday end. So therefore it is paramount that today is like the last day for the submarine to be found. If it is not found, if it is still safe, and if it is not found, then there is little hope of rescuing the 53 individuals of the crew of the submarine. Then moving on the international news, on business level, the State Bank of India has trimmed down the GDP outlook in times of COVID wave. As more and more people are getting infected, offices in general are also running at limited capacity, not only because of limitations and curbs by the government, but also because their own employees are getting affected by the coronavirus. So in that regard, it needs to be seen whether India will actually be able to maintain the 12.5 growth that the government of India had predicted for Indian economy this year. Then moving on the sporting front, also nothing of real note for us to discuss in that regard. On the ESL side, there is still no update for us, in the sense that the sanctions, whether sanctions will be imposed on those clubs who have broken away and formed the ESL, that needs to be seen, and whether that happens or not. So therefore we are waiting, because not the 12 clubs name and the organization that they formulated, the European Super League. Now that is one fact, but what are the consequences of the news? What happens to those clubs who have done it now that they have backtracked? What is the status quo? It is those things that become equally important for us to discuss, as there is still no certainty about it. It is still a speculative news and thus not relevant for us till now. On that note, I will conclude for the day. In today's newspaper, international news of ASEAN becomes the most important one. Give ASEAN summit a little bit of reading. Wait, we are going to discuss the new summit tomorrow, but the history of ASEAN becomes equally important for us to be discussed. On that note, I will conclude for the day. I suggest all the viewers to use earphones while we are recording from home, because the sound quality otherwise is limited. On that note, if you like the work that we are doing, please give this video a thumbs up, because it is your energy and appreciation that keeps us going and make us strive for more improvements. On that note, thank you so much. Take care of yourselves and your family members, and I will see you all tomorrow.